It's
now time to resume our meeting. I have to read out the instruction again. If you have the need, you can make use of headphone. And we've got floor for channel 1 and English for channel 2 and Pt2 for channel 3. And whatever you say is not going to be protected by electoral privileges and immunity ordinance, powers and privileges ordinance. And also security measures contained in the guideline for attending public meetings of electoral in public gallery already tell you what you're supposed to do and what security personnel would do in dealing with various situations. And also, if you have spoken according to your script, it would be best if you could supply your script to us for record and better reference. Mr. Ho Chi-chung, I am a member of the concerned group on anti-eviction. Now, what is meant by anti-eviction? Now, the public hearing on tenancy control really isn't the first of its kind. The last time was around 4 to 5 years, and last time 4 to 5 years, I was already there to speak on this. But 4 to 5 years have elapsed, and there has not been any improvement at all. And concerning CB 714-15 paper, the government says that if tenancy control measures are being implemented in haste, it will not be in public interest. And that was being said in 2015, and now 3 years have gone by. So is it still too rushed to put into practice tenancy control? And the Secretary of Housing has reported to his office for a certain period of time, and he has met with us quite a number of times. However, over the issue of tenancy control, what has the government done at all? And the government keeps saying that we should steer clear of tenancy control because it will reduce housing supply, and tenancy control implementation would result in unintended spillover effect. If that is indeed the case, while the government is telling us the downside of tenancy control, what other things you can do in order to try to effect it? Many concerned groups, including my own, have met with the Deputy Secretary for Housing. And from the very beginning, he already said that we shouldn't waste our time talking about tenancy control. And he was saying that it would be very, very difficult to change tenancy control legislation. And our impression was that he simply had not done his homework at all. And all along, they have been holding fast to their position. Of course, the present tenancy legislation is fraught with shortcomings. I hope that Secretary of Housing can try to plug such loopholes. First of all, about implementation of tenancy agreement or execution of tenancy agreement. And very often, landlords depart from tenancy agreement when it comes to executing its conditions. Very often, tenancy agreement says 1 month's notice. But landlords sometimes can harass the tenants in order to evict them prematurely. And when tenants report such harassment to the police simply refuse to take on such cases. I'd like to know whether the Housing Bureau can do something here. Can the Ratings and Valuation Department be brought in to help? And the Land Administration can also be brought in to help. Secondly, adjudication mechanism. And this actually could be considered. And thirdly, about tenancy legislation review for rights to renewal. I'm sorry, your time is up. Madam Leung Ho Ling. I represent Sham Shui Po residents' housing needs. I myself live in a subdivided unit. The previous landlord increased my rental from $4,500 to $7,000. Of course, I couldn't afford it. And so over the telephone, we reached an agreement that if I were to move out, then he would return a month's rental to me. But he had not done that at all. And I'm only a woman, and there was very little I could do. Now, because upstairs of us was a toilet, and it was leaking water, and as a result I had to move out, and my deposit was being held by the tenant without returning it to me. And also the current landlord has been very, very unwilling to fix my flats whenever I discovered any areas of disrepair. Now, during the past few weeks, when weather was excruciatingly hot, the aircon broke down, and I kept telling my landlord that he had to replace the aircon. And after a very long delay of several weeks, he finally sent someone to my flat to replace the aircon. But at the same time, he refused to provide me with a device or any container to take the water produced by the aircon, and he simply said that you could use your own water bucket to take the water produced by the aircon. And so is it that even if I am paying over $5,000 for such a tiny flat, I still have to put up with that? And earlier on, the Secretary for Housing has taken letter petition from us, and he said that we should hang in there. Now, against such a background, how can we hang on? Last November, member has already put in 2 private members' bill to ban private transfer or private sale of utility charges. We'd like to know what is the progress on the private members' bill. Now, if the living conditions are too bad, of course, we could move out. However, in so doing, we have to pay rental both to the last tenant as well as the new last landlord as well as the new landlord. And relocation is very costly because we live in tenement buildings. And last time I moved, I was being quoted the price of $8,000 for relocation. So under such circumstances, for us grassrooters, how could we possibly hang on? And what the government can do in order to help us to hang on?
Lam.
Mr. Yaukin Lam. So we saw Secretary Chan sort of choking up or seemed to feel for the residents. I have strong doubts whether he truly understands the needs of the grassroots. The administration difficulties have been outlined, claiming difficulty in finding enough land for housing and having adequate supply. And on tenancy control, they were led to counterproductiveness. Have we done any review? We're not asking that you must do it, but first, would you consider reviewing this? So where's the government in this? So since rent control was implemented back then, it demonstrated a need. So a decade on without rent control, is it really that hard for you to conduct a review? Isn't that your job? And you claim that you will put the money directly into the public's pocket, first through CSSA and through the Working Family Allowance. The residents have asked me, are you asking everyone to apply for CSSA? I know a case of a CSA recipient of $1,800 a month, and now the rent on the STU is about north of $3,000. So can CSA help him in this case? And a lot of the CSA recipients were not able to cover their rent. Besides CSSA, well, there are a lot of people that qualify since they're asset of over $40,000. And yet they are living just as tough. So you claim they're incapable to hold this high office. You should have a duty to take care of them instead of claiming that you've done your best. So you came to putting money into the public's pocket. Besides the CSSA, rent subsidy is a kind of direct assistance. tenancy control, besides rent control, there are other components that been discussed before. For example, priority right of renewal, and you claim that you will consider, for example, entering a formal agreement and renewal priority. I think you should take it seriously, otherwise the public will be miserable. First, you should review the tenancy control. If you don't implement it, you should lay out the grounds why you're against it. Instead of saying casually, taking an example of other countries, you can see being counterproductive, and yet with no research undertaken. So what are you relying on? Next, Ms. Chen Wing-Tong. Thank you, Madam Chair. So while listening in from the public gallery, I'm quite disappointed by the Secretary Chan's statement. It claims that you've exhausted all the means and all the existing measures will be sufficient to meet the needs, accommodation needs of the grassroots. These are not really measures targeting the grassroots accommodation issue like CSSA or the allowances or the any kind of subsidies. Tenancy control, if the government are willing to greenlight it, it could really benefit the grassroots right away. Why not consider it? So be refusing on a lot of grounds, for example, reducing the housing supply. Since 1771 to 1998, during the rent control period, the vacancy in that period had not a substantial increase. And by 1998, after the removal of rental control, the vacancy rate has been on the rise. So speaking of numbers, not able to reflect the reduction in supply. For 2016, for those who own more than 3 homes have reached about 90,000 people. And those owning 6 units or more, they're about 30,000 people. And yet, the vacancy rate is still severe. So even without tenancy control, the tenancy rate is high enough. This is no reason for pushing back. So they may lead to behavior by landlords, for example, using very miscellaneous charges, for example, overcharging utilities that will add to the burden of the grassroots. The government could actually regulate on the charging of utilities. Why don't the government act on it? And for the utilities, like water and power and management fees and other fees, could be regulated, which the property landlord can be excused of imposing the charges on the tenants. And you claim that will reduce the motivation for maintenance and the desire to lease out. Well, a lot of the units have been poorly maintained or not at all, where the tenant bore the responsibility of maintenance. For some countries, there are also some kind of exit mechanism. If the landlord is willing to perform maintenance, they will not be subject to the tenancy control. Therefore, they will have increased motivation to perform maintenance. Next, Ms. Wang Xiaoyin. I have a sore throat today. I've been living in a SDU for 6 years. So from the $2,500 in rent today, paying $5,000 a month, it made it of half of my income. So in 2016, I've been living in wealth. I have a good landlords, and I'm living on the top floor and very poorly ventilated. So on May 30th, I wanted to know how hot my flat get. It was 38 Celsius. So at that temperature, I should be seeing a doctor. Since I'm living on the top floor, the ventilation duct was at my floor facing my window, and it stinked. One time there's a graduation party in my building and forgot to flush, and all this an odor flow into my unit. And everyone suggested I should be moving. I very much hope to move. The secretary probably wouldn't know. For the 100 square foot, I couldn't afford the rent at this level. Some of them might be slightly cheaper. Like the deputation before me, for you to relocate, you have to pay rent at 2 places at the same time and to pay the agent's fees and so on. Therefore, I chose to put up with that stinky flat. Hope the administration can legislate on tenancy control for SDU tenants, so that I would not be subject to arbitrary rent increase by landlords. You couldn't bargain with for any increase they propose. I hope that the increase could be restricted to not more than 5% and should be set at reasonable levels. With the utilities have been overcharged. The unit next to me, for every wall, they'll be charged over $100 for an $18 per ton of water. Some of them charge per head, and $70 or $80 per head. Hope the administration can regulate the landlords from overcharging. The government should draft a standard tenancy agreement as well. Next, Mr. Lee Tai-shing. I know a lot of the SDU residents. Today I bring a picture of a tiger head. I'm not saying that your policies are tough. It's just that the rent is just as ferocious as a tiger. So a lot of the residents' rental payment made up half of their income. And the secretaries and the members should have no problem meeting mortgage payments. However, for the residents making over about $10,000 and is spending 40% on housing, they simply don't have money to meet to expenses, and claim that some of them doesn't have enough money to buy enough meat. And we consider going vegetarian. So the grassroots residents are facing enormous rental pressure and a risk of eviction and frequent rent increases. The government had done nothing and let this tiger roam freely. And the secretary claimed that the landlords may choose to hoard their flats and not leasing them out. And they're making so much excellent rental that why would they refuse to make profit from it? So where the vested interests or the consortium is concerned, you wouldn't dare to touch it. You wouldn't even consider the vacancy tax. So I think the Secretary Chan is one very much like a Zen-style secretary. So there's no vacancy tax and no tenancy control, and hope that the rental problems would go away by itself. I don't have. So I'm gonna give you this prop for you. Okay. Please finish your deputation. It's a waste of time. Ms. Lo Ka-lai. I'm engaged in challenge work, but why am I sitting here today? I want to speak to the secretary. In my work, most often I come across of children living in inadequately housed household. Housing is a vital commodity. Mothers hope to provide a roof over their children's head. In reality, can mothers really doing a good job on this? There's over 60,000 children on CSSA requiring a full books and textbook allowance. I believe that those present have a very memorable childhood. So what you're doing, thinking about what will your mother cook for you and where to hang out? Have you been ever worried about where you will live? I met a lot of inadequately housed households. They live in all sorts of housing. Some live in rooftop housing, SDU housing, or living in the fire escaped. Disadvantaged mothers, and they have ticks. They have been looking for housing. However, the agent claims that because they are a single family and lack a stable income, and they were refused a tenant, and yet they were forced to stay in that flea-infested unit. Another case, due to rent increase and for a victim within a month, after they moved in, the toilet had not been fixed in the SDU, and now they only can shower in the sports center. When due to rent increases every day, they were concerned. So what is a sprightly and energetic children become very quiet. I believe that this grassroots children will not want to become precocious and worry too much over their accommodation and not feel so much pressure on their daily existence. They're also entitled to a happy childhood, but what had the government done? Secretary Chen, after hearing so much deputations, when will the tenancy control happening? When will you provide them with a happy childhood and the right to development? We hope to have the tenancy control legislation. Next, Mr. Wong Kah-chun.
Mr. Wong Kah-chun, would you please switch on your microphone? He's in a different seat. Thank you. Our Kaifongs have already let you know their lots, and so I'm not going to repeat them. Now, rentals are only going up, never down. And if you look at the figures, you know that that's true. And during the past decade, we see that rental control has been lifted in order to, according to the government, balance the housing market. But still, so many problems have existed in the housing market, and they are saying that in place of tenancy control, they could resort to a rental allowance or transportation allowance and other welfare subsidies to deal with the situation. But actually, those are all irrelevant to housing issues. And also, you have done away with tenancy control. And also, the CSSA rental allowance simply is inadequate, cannot cover the high rental allowance. And social welfare housing also is inadequately funded. And in 2014, you said that tenancy control actually would be counterproductive. It will reduce housing supply, and it will reduce chances for underprivileged people to find housing, and also landlords would have more incentive to overcharge for utilities and so on and so forth. At this point in time, when the rental market is so buoyant and when landlords are making so much profit, I really don't see a scenario where landlords will refrain from renting out their flats, even with rental control. And also with tenancy control, there can be a redress of the imbalance between a redress against imbalance between the landlords and tenants. powers, and also both sides would be protected, and tenancy agreements would prevent utilities from being overcharged. And underprivileged people can then have a better chance of finding suitable housing. And whether or not there is tenancy control, landlords also will have to do repair. It's their job. They have to keep up and maintain their flats. And so whether or not tenancy control is in place really is irrelevant. And you can also put in a tax incentive in order to encourage landlords to upkeep the quality of their flats. It's been repeatedly claimed that the government always should stick close to the policy of positive non-intervention. But housing really is a necessity. It's not a luxury item. And that's why the government must make sure that the housing market becomes balanced again, and tenants would not be subject to excessive rents, and rents would not be out of control. And also, living conditions must be guaranteed at a certain level, and subdivided units should not be allowed at all. Madam Wu, you have brought your kids along, and your kid really behaves themselves. I am a resident from Kwun Tong. I'm paying over $5,000 for rental every month, and my subdivided unit actually is a luxury version of subdivided units. But my kai fongs actually are in very, very poor conditions, and they dare not come forth to say anything because they're afraid that landlords would dislike them and kick them out. And so I'm not speaking for myself, but speaking on behalf of many of my fellow residents, of fellow tenants of subdivided units. And we are not making a lot of money at all. We are making just over $10,000, and paying rental already accounts for half of that. And also we have to pay for remedial and tutorial classes for our kids and so on and so forth. And that's why we have to economize very, very severely on other expenses such as food. So if you have tenancy control, I'm sure conscionable landlords wouldn't mind. And the unconscionable landlords are overcharging utilities and are overcharging for rental. I don't think good landlords would mind having tenancy control, and so please take that into consideration. We've got more time for this session, and so Secretary of Housing, you can give more detailed response. After the Secretary of Housing has given his response, then it will be up to you to speak. And so please come down in time. And also we need to deal with a motion, so please come back to this venue to deal with the motion. Thank you, convener, and thank you, deputations, for your views. So I have heard your difficulties clearly. Let me tell you how did we end up in such a difficult situation with regard to housing supply. If you look at the Land Supply Consultative Group's document, you know that the yearly construction between 1997 and 2006, the yearly construction volume has been 50,000 flats, and before that it's been between 2016 and 2011 it's been 20,000 flats, and so now we have a very, very long backlog. And at present, our vacancy rate for our housing market is 3.7%. It is a record low. So indeed, housing is in very, very short supply in Hong Kong. And that is why we are now in such a difficult situation. And we fully understand the difficulties that you face. Now, some have pointed out the problem of selling off utilities charging rights by landlords. I understand that some of our lawmakers have put forward private members' bill. And I just want to tell you that our Environment Bureau is now taking the initiative to deal with this. And as for the call for vacancy tax, and the Financial Secretary on some public occasions have already mentioned that the government is looking at it. And also, media friends have asked me about this, and I have told them that we're going to complete the study as soon as possible. Whenever there is a decision, we'll notify you of the decision as soon as possible. And Madam Wu has pointed out very rightly, which I agree fully, that conscionable landlords really do not require any restriction or any regulation or any conscionable agreements to act appropriately and act properly with regard to tenancy matters. But some landlords indeed are very greedy and very inappropriately aggressive. As a result, they have imposed undue pressure on their tenants. I just want to say here that the government is not shirking its responsibility. Indeed, if there is a need, we could go down the legislative route. Now, whether it's rental control and tenancy control or any other amendments to legislation, if indeed there is proof that this would help our grassrooters, we are not going to hesitate in going down that route. But tenancy control is not a matter of that kind. In 2013, we studied this issue, and in 2014, we produced a report for LegCo. And as far as we can see in the community, there is no consensus. And tenancy control has both an upside and a downside. And tenancy control can bring about unintended spillover effect. So if you want to strike a balance between the two, it would be better for us to resort to already available avenues to come up with measures in order to help our tenants in difficulties. And I'm very willing to take this up with the Welfare Bureau. Just now it's been mentioned that single people who are living in subdivided units, the CSSA can only get $1,800, and their subdivided units already cost them $5,000 a month. And so indeed there is a very wide gap between the two. And so let's go back and talk this out with the Social Welfare Bureau. And the Community Care Fund also has options for providing subsidies for people who are employed but who are underprivileged. And as I said, I promise I'm going to take this up with the welfare sector as well as the Health and Welfare Bureau to come up with further measures to relieve the hardship faced by our tenants that are in difficulties. As for tenancy control, if you take all factors into consideration, it simply is not true that we have not followed up on it. It's only that we have already looked at the matter, and we have seen that the situation has not changed from several years ago when we concluded that tenancy control was counterproductive. And so please don't say that we have not done anything on this at all. It is not true. It's only that we have looked at the matter, and it is our conclusion still that tenancy control is counterproductive, and that's why it would be better for us to resort to other avenues. Of course, we are all ears. We'd like to hear your views. And in due course, we can carry out in-depth discussion with stakeholders as well as relevant government departments and authorities. Mr. Au Chong-sing. Madam Convener, I have to thank deputations once again, and I've been seated here hearing views, and I think the government is quite helpless here. The government simply cannot come up with any effective policies. I think, Secretary of Housing, the very first thing that you have done after you have reported to office was to pay a visit to a subdivided unit in Toh Guan Wan, and I got the impression on that occasion that you really were serious in addressing the issue. And today, I really don't know whether you truly appreciate the hardship faced by subdivided tenants, or is it that the other members of the Housing Bureau are dragging your feet? And over 100,000 people are in dire hardship. And their first thing that they need is to find suitable housing and reasonable housing. But landlords are more often than not conscionable, and landlords simply would evict their tenants if they cannot afford even a reasonable rental. And so this is a very sad situation. I hope that Secretary of Housing, you can be more courageous here. You can be more valiant here in helping the tenants and see what you can do. Secretary of Housing, you say that if there is something that would be helpful to grassroots tenants, you definitely would do it. Then, if that is the case, how come you refuse to consider tenancy control? Now, there are so many issues here and there's so many concerns. Why do you refuse to introduce tenancy control? Because this definitely would provide some respite for grassroots tenants that have been on the waiting list for public housing for over 3 years. And Secretary of Housing has been repeatedly stating the point of housing supply. And from now to 2022, 90,000 flats in public housing category will be completed. But what about up to 2030? And we have not seen anything concrete from the government that can really address the situation effectively. Now, it seems that you even failed to catch up to previous backlog. And how are you going to deal with new shortages? And after 2030, what new land supply will there be, and what new flat production program will you put together? Now, I have followed up on this on previous occasions, but you have yet to give me a response. And also, you refuse even to say that you would study into the possibility of tenancy control. Now, just now you said that tenancy control would bring about a whole series of issues. But couldn't you at least ask relevant government authorities to commence studying into this issue to see whether tenancy control is indeed as unviable as you claim? Otherwise, Hong Kong would be in a disastrous situation. Now, basically,
provide appropriate housing for the grassroots will be an important mission for the Housing Authority and Housing Association. The Housing Department and the Housing Authority in the past had put their effort into it. And for the public housing about to be demolished, if these units can be used for temporary housing, we have done that for Pt2 estate. In different estate, we maximize the number of units that can be built. The civil service, together with the Bureau, commitment that I hope that we can have the public trust on that. Why are we hesitant on the tenancy control? If we should spend public money on the grassroots household, we would consider offering direct assistance into the benefiting households. If only it benefit the other parties, such as the intermediaries, we would try to avoid that. For after 2023, what can we do? We're now trying to achieve a public consensus on land supply. And for the Children 10 plan rezoning for public housing, we'll put more effort into it as well. Mr. Jeremy Tam. On the issue of tenancy issue, it all had to do with supply and how greedy the landlords manipulate the market. The Civic Party have always stressed that up to now there are about 9,000 or 10,000 idle units that's neither sold or withheld by the owners. May I ask the Secretary, where would the government propose the first-hand property vacancy tax to let go? Thank you for Mr. Tam's question. On the vacancy rate of the first-hand property, we are quite concerned. On various occasions, we stated we are looking into the vacancy tax for first-hand property. And this morning, the Finance Secretary have indicated that the study is close to completion. And just now, I spoke to the press, and I said that we will expedite to complete the study. Once we arrive at decision, we'll make it public and to let go. So for all these units, if there's no effective way to release them to the market, regardless of how much land put in the market, the developers could simply withhold these units. In terms of planning and land disposal, that will have an impact. Of course, some developers will claim that this 9,000 units, some of them will be will be leased out, and the administration should look into how many units are to be designated as rental units. And last week, Dennis Kwok had filed a written question that by transferring the units from the parent company to the subsidiary to be save taxes, how many of the units have transferred by this arrangement? That means administration replies that it was excluded. So even for the unsold first-hand units, there should be more than 9,000 of those. I hope that the government could launch something really soon. As for the second page of the document 2 to 4, so you cite the example of a stock on the supply situation on Stockholm. Well, simply put, if there are rent control, they will lead to inadequate supply and result in increasing waiting time. In some areas, you wait for almost a decade. You're quoting from footnote 3, this OECD survey. But do you know that, and how did Stockholm implement their tenancy control? So how do you come up with their formula, or what is it Pt2? As for the actual operations and actual numbers, allow me to provide them after the meeting. Why I'm asking this, since you put this down, I expect the colleagues behind you to know. So look at the BBC report. They have a difference with Hong Kong. They will not allow a major companies buy up a lot of units in the same buildings. And second, Stockholm had the highest proportion of one-person units. And thirdly, back in 2013, when they calculate the rent control levels, is pegged to the mortgage payments. So it's quite different from the Hong Kong situations. The Secretary have heard Mr. Tam. Next, Mr. Vincent Chang. First, I would like to thank all the deputations to speak of their hardship in living in SDU units. So those in the chamber and myself clearly understand your feelings. So a lot of deputation have expressed that already. First, on tenancy control, we hope that you could actively look into it instead of outright refusal. And we can see a lot of examples with a room for fine-tuning. Even though they pass tenancy control have generated a lot of problems, which you mentioned frequently already. Of course, that you can able to rectify the past issues, come up with new ways to deal with tenancy control, or maybe have a partial implementation or innovative methods. Why are you ruling that out? And a lot of deputations and members mentioned more than issue of tenancy control. The landlords have come up with different ways to deceive the tenants for rather refusing to enter a tenancy agreement or arbitrary rent increases, or delegating full authority to estate agent or invisible landlords. And the tenants have no way to cope. A decade ago, there could be just a sporadic numbers of landlords engaging in SDUs. Now that they frequently have a lot of landlords owning 60 to 70 units. So they're making a lot of money every month and also be entitled to their government benefits because they all been paid through CSA and yet are not willing to improve their management or communicate with the buildings. How can we tolerate this unscrupulous landlords from continuing to exploit the tenants? Can you come up with any short-term measures to plug these loopholes? So let's not talk about tenancy control. For the problem cited by Mr. Ho, how can you let them jack up the rents arbitrarily, yet refuse to enter a tenancy agreement? Secretary. Mr. Ho mentioned on the enforcement of tenancy agreement on harassing tenants and arbitration will be noted. In our society, it's inevitable that some of the landlords, in the negotiating the tenancy agreements or relocation, to lead to exploitative behavior. How to help the vulnerable groups in renting the SDU units to be entitled to a fairer negotiations. After the meeting, we're willing to meet with the supporting organizations and social service agencies or the pressure groups. I frequently met with them. Hope that we can discuss with them what kind of arrangements can be in place to help these vulnerable residents in leasing the inappropriate and inadequately housed household in getting a fair treatment. That I can promise. So let's not talk about. Okay, maybe for the short term you can have some social service organizations do some referrals, or maybe you can work with the Home Affairs Department or offer an arbitration or a complaint mechanism so that they would not be as swindled as frequently. That can you promise to help the tenants? That I will do so, because I will go to the community to visit various SDU tenants and housing estates. I will follow up with the relevant welfare organizations. Next, Mr. Michael Chen, he's left the room. Mr. Eddie Chu. Chairman, how many minutes? 4 minutes. So it's happening all around the world. When there are bad times, the administration will come up with ways to regulate or new liberalism policies. Hong Kong is no exception. Last time we lifted the rental control, it was bad economic times. For an overeating economy, unless there an asset and price increase and a rent increase, the administration should return to intervene. Hong Kong is rather strange. In good economic times, you kept on maintaining this neoliberalist policy on regulation. So it has become the survival of the fittest. The Secretary should consider for any interventions, you should differentiate three aspects. First, with the rent control, as well as the 10-year security, as well as the rent increase restriction. And your papers sometimes just mixed up all three. So apply it where it fits. And only spoke of the adverse impact, but not the positives. I haven't mentioned the short and the long-term consequences. You frequently mention the best solution is to increase land supply. I wouldn't bother refuting that. If there are other tools at your disposal, one of which will be, let's set aside rental control. How about the 10-year security as well, the rent increase restriction, so that you can promise to the pressure groups as a short-term measure, or so you can talk about the short-term consequences of any proposed initiatives. Then what is the beneficiaries, and then you can move on to your other initiatives. For example, transitional housing. You shouldn't stop at this social housing on CSSA. I propose that you should borrow those PLA barracks so you can provide for 50,000 people. So the demand for the SUs will drop in the long run. For the supply of the public housing, how could you bolster it? Then you can show that you truly a multi-pronged approach. And now you're being evasive and only have over one tool of increasing land supply. However, it's not able to address the current situation, as well as acting against a proper governance of the government. I hope that all the other studies, when undertaken, that you could give a proper account of the three aspects: rent control, priority on renewal, and rent increase restriction. You should separate all three, and in your study, you should outline what the pros and cons of each, and the beneficiaries, and what are the adverse consequences, so that we give the holistic view. So you only focus on negative and not the positive. 30 seconds, Secretary. Like Mr. Chu said, at the end, it all comes down to the land supply. We speak a lot of charity organizations, and Development Bureau had allocated $1 billion on the optimal use of government structures and government land. I hope that the optimal use of government buildings. So besides the best solution, of course, we have to expedite the housing construction and the housing supply. Are you willing to undertake this study that I mentioned? Next, Mr. Michael Tian.
My organization has all along been advocating partial tenancy control, but we do not support comprehensive and complete tenancy control. We believe that tenancy control should target only subdivided units and other substandard housing. Now, the government is coming forth with a very resounding no to tenancy control. And of course, you have stated all the side effects of tenancy control, and your first two side effects say that underprivileged people will have more difficulty finding housing, and also tenancy, I beg your pardon, housing supply would actually be reduced. And that is why we believe that tenancy control should be implemented in tandem with vacancy tax. And the Financial Secretary said that he would look at first-hand vacancy tax, but not second-hand vacancy tax. I think that is really objectionable. If you do not have second-hand vacancy tax, actually, indeed, it would reduce housing supply. And your third side effect say that landlords will try to find ways to go around tenancy control. Say overcharging of deposits and overcharging of utilities, levies actually are solvable if your legislation is drafted in an appropriate manner. Of course, other cities have experienced problems with tenancy control, but other cities have not had our experience with double stamp duty and bias stamp duty and so on and so forth. And yet you have come up with these two innovative taxes in order to deal with overheating of the property market. And so tenancy control actually can be relaxed for a couple of years, and then when necessary you can also tighten it. Very dire situations call for very drastic measures. Tenancy control can be a short-term measure. I'm not saying that it should be in place indefinitely. I'm just saying that like 8 years ago, I stayed in subdivided unit for 2 nights, and I had 30 neighbors. And I recall that 20 of them said that they would definitely stay in subdivided housing, and even if they were allocated public rental housing, they said that they simply wouldn't move, even if they were offered public rental housing, because they wouldn't want to move to new territories, and they want to stay in their existing and present community because they like it. So even if you were to increase public rental housing, you would not solve the problem of shortage of housing in the urban area, which we are now facing. And finally, Secretary of Housing, you say that there is no consensus in society. I just want to know exactly how did you phrase your questions. Did you ask people whether they would support full or wholesale tenancy control, or did you ask them whether they would support partial tenancy control? Where did you draw a line? Secretary of Housing. Now, of course, when it comes to the issue of tenancy control, the government actually has a full understanding on the issues that members have outlined. Now you say that there is no consensus on society. Is it that society does not have consensus on full tenancy control or partial tenancy control? I understand your point. What I'm trying to say is that whether it's partial tenancy control or wholesale tenancy control, there is no consensus in society. Now, what about the lack of consensus even on subdivided flats? Are you saying that even there is no, for subdivided units, there is no societal consensus? Now, you do not have sufficient support in society to address the problem of subdivided units? Now, we are very soon going to deal with a motion from Mr. Tim Buxton, and that is why I hope that colleagues will come down to this venue as soon as possible. And now it's my turn to speak. I'm going to take time out of my allocated time for dealing with motion. I remember that I was first lawmaker in 2012, and back then we were told by the government that there were over 10,000 people living in subdivided units. And back then, we already asked the government to review landlords and tenants ordinance and to provide tax allowance for tenants and also to provide rental subsidies. And Mr. Wong Kwok Hing and myself have made a petition to the Developers Association, Real Estate Association, saying that developers were hawking their properties at the real estate without putting them on the market for sale. And we also subsequently recommended that Cat A of residential flats as categorized by Ratings and Valuation Department should be used as a dividing line for implementing tenancy control. And we have outlined 3 categories of housing, such as subdivided flats and cage housing, and very, very excessively small flats for rental control. And so and we also recommended that there should be a mandatory notice period of 3 months and also vacancy tax and so on and so forth. But the government did nothing at all. So subsequently, we put forward a 3-pronged approach. Rental allowance for people on PRH waiting list, and then tenancy control, and then vacancy tax. So a 3-pronged approach to help grassroots to at least address their near-term housing problems. But again, the government did nothing. And so myself and Mr. Luk Chung Hong have put in private members' bill. I put forward a private member bill to ban landlord from selling off their charging of water bills. And Mr. Luk had a similar private members' bill for electricity bills. The government very swiftly objected to Mr. Luk's bill, and the government had yet to come back on my bill. Of course, we are not going to allow the government to sit on the bottom and do nothing and let the whole thing die down. Secretary of Housing, I share your very deep feelings towards this. When we see grassroots living in very, very poor conditions and yet having to pay proportionally very expensive rental, we feel very, very bad, as you do. We have done a lot ourselves, but what about you, Secretary of Housing? What have you done? Now, we have recommended very clearly that Rating and Valuation Department Cat A flats should come under tenancy control. Now, if everybody is so concerned about people living in subdivided units, why can't you reopen this review for partial tenancy control, i.e., for flats or for buildings that are likely to become subdivided units buildings, can you at least look at the possibility of putting them under tenancy control? Just now, it was recommended that first-hand properties should be subject to vacancy tax, but actually we believe that the same should be done for second-hand vacancy tax. So, vacancy tax and partial tenancy control. Secretary of Housing, would you be willing to reopen review on these two issues with a view to applying them to certain category of residential buildings, i.e. Cat A residential buildings? I heard you loud and clear. Now, I can promise you that after the meeting, I'm going to take the matter up with Health and Welfare Bureau and other relevant bureau to see whether there are other avenues open to us to lend assistance to tenants. Now, if you look at LTHS, there is already a very clear representation with regard to our position on tenancy control. And against the backdrop of LTHS, we have already mounted certain initiatives for implementation of LTHS. Now, for unsuitable housing, for excessively small flats, and for subdivided flats, and for flats that are tools of exploitation. Now, indeed, I promise you I'm going to address these issues through the avenues that I have outlined, i.e. in conjunction with other bureaus. Now, please don't hide behind LTHS, because I don't think you are in any position to complete the LTHS at all. And so please be pragmatic and address the issues in a focused manner. And table in front of us is a motion from Mr. Tim Buxton, and he has put forward a motion. And I think we have to ring the bell now so that we can bring back our colleagues for voting. How many are we short of?
13個。
We need 13.
好啦，等多啲人先讀啦。
Why don't you read it out when more of us have come in? When the bell is on, we cannot read it out.
Let
me read this out. Why don't you wait till the bell is off?
齊人咁啊。
Right, there is enough of us. Mr. Teen, would you please read out your motion? Because there is a very serious imbalance in public housing supply, and subdivided flats are subject to excessive rent, and the grassrooters are finding them unaffordable. And so in order to reduce the pressure, this panel would urge the government to move ahead with partial tenancy control targeting residential flats under a certain area and under a certain rental level. And the relevant measures should not be limited to flats that the landlords are self-occupying or living in or can resume. And also tenants should have right for first renewal, and rentals should be pegged to inflation and also a certain percentage and market rental for nearby flats. And those who are in objection, those who are abstaining, and those who are in support of the motion, show of hands, please.
OK 好，我哋通過嘅。
The motion is carried. The motion is carried. We've got no AOB. There is another public hearing scheduled for 10:45 on July 6th. I hope that you all attend that meeting. Thank you, deputations, for coming to meet with us, and thank you, Secretary of Housing.